Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. We got a hell of a show for you tonight. For all my gripes about the lack of social housing in BC, let's talk about an innovative social housing health center project in Vancouver's downtown east side and how it will set the standard for much needed social housing in this province. But first, you may have heard of the introduction of parental rights legislation in several provinces, including New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, all seemingly supported by Conservative Party of Canada leader Pierre Poilievre. But will this legislation cause more harm than good? Here to discuss is a Métis comedian and entertainer. You can find him on The Serfs, the largest Canadian political show on Twitch, which is a live video streaming service, in case you're unaware. He is Lance of The Serfs. Lance, what an honor. Thanks for being here tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me. That was a really nice intro.
Oh, absolutely. So let's try to make sense of this parental rights legislation. What are we talking about when we're talking about parental rights legislation?
Right. So parental rights, it sounds really good, right? Obviously, I don't think anyone wants to be on the other side of that issue.
Sure.
That's why you often
I'm pro-parent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. I think we all are. And that's why you might hear them say things like parental rights or protect the kids or things like that. And it's often worded in a way in that it's going to incite something inside you. You're going to feel, maybe duty calls. I should be backing this without knowing everything about it.
Right.
When you actually get into what these bills do, they can be very harmful to children. And it's kind of like one of those things where it's ironic. It's framed in such a way that you think, hey, this actually might actually help kids, whereas at the end of the day, LGBTQ plus kids exist. They go to school like everybody else, and these are going to both target them and other them.
So let's get into some of this legislation that we're actually talking about. In New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, students under 16 who are questioning their gender identity have to get parental consent before teachers can use their preferred first names or pronouns or gender identity. Even if the teacher wants to use them, they're not allowed. It's far more expansive in Alberta, where upcoming legislation includes a similar piece about preferred names and pronouns, but also includes the following. Top and bottom surgeries are banned for youth under 17, and I'll note that bottom surgeries are already not performed on youth. Hormone therapies for gender affirmation is banned for youth under 15, and parents will have to opt in for any time a teacher plans to teach about gender identity and sexual orientation. So for folks unfamiliar with these policies, what is the harm that potentially could be done to trans youth or non-binary youth?
So just to be clear, for a lot of these things, when you hear about gender affirming care, if it happens to involve a kid who's anywhere between, let's say, the ages of like 3 and 8, gender affirming care takes the form of using different names and pronouns, but there's no surgeries, there's no hormone replacement, there's no puberty blockers. That happens once someone enters puberty.
Right.
So for a lot of the like age demographic that people are usually talking about when they talk about protect the kids or save the kids, it has nothing to do with surgeries. It has nothing to do with hormones. It sounds a lot more incendiary, or it makes for better headlines, right? If you see something like that. The reality is that a lot of these children, they are going to be going to school like everyone else. They should feel safe like everyone else. And I don't think that there's anything controversial about using pronouns the same way we have our entire lives.
Right.
Right. Like if someone asks you, hey, by the way, I'm he, him, you're he, him, I assume.
Yeah.
We've been doing that our whole lives. It's
Sure.
not difficult or complex, right? And so for children who might be trans, which is a very small percentage of the population, they, like anyone else, should be able to feel safe. That's basically where I would start with that. When you're bringing up the fact that this has been brought up in other places like, say, New Brunswick, right? Something that should be emphasized here is that a Freedom of Information Act revealed that there had been no complaints to to teachers from parents on the behalf of this is something where I don't know about my kid's pronouns or this is a problem. Like, this was not an issue that was concerning parents. This is an issue that seems to be thrust upon parents. And then once it becomes part of the zeitgeist or the culture wars or whatever you want to call it, all of a sudden we're having a discussion like this where it's like, well, is this about protecting kids? Is it about keeping them safe?
Or is
right?
it just about politics?
Or is it just about politics, right? And again, I'm sure there's enough problems in the world right now.
Sure.
Like you've seen the headlines and stuff.
Yeah.
There's probably things that should concern voters or people who want politicians to represent them to be enacting in the real world, not targeting a problem that is effectively only going to make a marginalized community their lives harder.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I mean, I feel like even when you look at these laws, there are a lot of things that are inconsistent. As I said, bottom surgeries aren't performed on youth as far as I know, as far as I've read.
Right.
Even top surgeries, they have been performed cosmetically on youth, and no one seemed to have an issue with that. But now, under this lens of LGBTQ or trans kids, politicians suddenly have an issue with it, right?
Well, I mean, the same thing applies to puberty blockers. Puberty blockers have been given to cis children who are not trans, for a very long time. It's actually FDA approved to use puberty blockers in the United States for the purposes if you have a kid who's got precocious puberty, like they enter puberty too quickly. That's not controversial. It's suddenly controversial when it's used as a form of gender affirming care. And I should add too that puberty blockers, the whole intent behind them is to be able to give someone a pause or an extension of time to be able to make a decision about whether or not they go on hormone replacement therapy. Doctors, physicians, anyone who deals with gender affirming care, they want kids to be off puberty blockers as quickly as possible.
Right.
This is just something that is, again, supposed to grant you some time to be able to make a very important decision.
And whether it is puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy, there is a medical protocol for these things. It's not like you just go to the pharmacist and pick up those drugs, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds scarier.
Sure.
like the idea that there's this revolving door between you walk into suddenly a clinic and they're like, I might be gay. And they're like, oh, you're trans. And they give you drugs or something. That's not the case at all. There's obviously, like anything else, there's a set of guidelines that have to be followed. There's a reason that every major medical association in the United States and most major medical associations in Canada all agree upon gender affirming care, that it's a valid form of healthcare, that it has incredible outcomes, that it can have life-changing effects on kids who undergo these procedures. But again, it's only a very small percentage of children who actually are trans.
Right.
So this is something
How small is that percentage?
It's estimated 0.7% right now. Okay. Although youth, Gen Z, typically are reporting much higher levels of being LGBTQ+, but that has a lot more to do with like acceptance, basically the proliferation of social media and having information and access to that. But I think what this comes down to is the two of us were having this discussion. We're not doctors. Mm-hmm. And we're not the parents of these kids. We're not the teachers of these kids. We're not the guardians of these children. These are discussions that should be between the parents, the doctors, and the kids.
Sure, yeah.
Not politicians. Not Daniel Smith, not somebody else saying that this is something that I should inject myself into. This is like any other form of healthcare, something that should be between the patients, the doctors, and the parents.
Let's talk about the parents, because even though obviously there's a whole basis of medical science behind this, we are seeing protests of parents protesting SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity resources in schools. We are seeing parents coming out in support of these parental rights legislations across the country. What would you say to those parents who are concerned about these things?
I'd say that any parent's concern about the welfare of their children is completely valid. Mm-hmm. No one wants to take that away, and no one's trying to be on the other side of that issue. What the unfortunate reality is that people have been sold a narrative on this, in that it's simply much more dangerous or something that is insidious, almost as if it is like an influence, a social contagion, a mind virus, something like that. It has nothing to do with that. The reported rates of people who identify as trans, even if that number is going up higher right now, that number, in the same way we used to persecute people who were left-handed, for example, right? If you look at the number of people who were left-handed and who reported being left-handed, that number spikes once we started, not saying people who are left-handed are sinister or the devil or stuff like that, but then it plateaus at about 12% of the population.
Right.
The same thing is happening right now to LGBTQ+ and trans people who are now being, they feel they're safe in an environment to be able to talk about this, and they're reporting, much higher numbers. But the idea that children can be turned trans or be turned gay is simply not based in science or reality. If that was the case, then there wouldn't be any, gay kids at all. I mean, well, the majority of media is straight, right? Like the majority of love that you see on Disney or stuff like that, they're all straight relationships or stuff like that. So if you could be influenced by outside contagions to change you, there wouldn't be gay kids. So the idea, like, that's why it is torture, but that's why conversion therapy is not effective at all, because you cannot turn kids gay any more than you can turn them straight. The same thing applies to students. So the idea for parents who think, if my kid goes to school and when they're attending classes, there's going to be a teacher who might use they, them pronouns, that might influence my child, it simply doesn't bear out in science or reality.
Fascinating. Yeah. It does feel like it's old school fear tactics that we've seen with other groups as well, right?
Yeah, it's recycling a lot of the gay panic for now what is known as the trans panic.
Yeah. Lance, this was a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Folks, that's Lance from the Serfs. Find the Serfs all over social media, and if you're on Twitch, be sure to tune into their content over there. Now, after some business, I'm very critical about the lack of social housing in this province, but I have some optimism for you tonight. Let's talk about a game-changing new project in Vancouver's Chinatown with one of its biggest champions up next.